Like yesterday, Dave talked about design, and tonight we're going to be talking about Darwin's evidence for biology and the evidences that have been built upon Darwin's view of biology. And we're going to ask, was Darwin wrong? Just to remind you, we looked at the overview of Genesis 7, and we see that Genesis 1 and 2 talk about creation. And from a scientific point of view, we see evidences of design. When we look at creation, we see amazing evidences of design. So if you didn't catch last night's program, we would encourage you to look for the replay on that. Tonight, we're going to focus in mostly on Genesis 3 to 5, because the question is, at the end of Genesis, at the end of the creation week, it says that everything was very good. God said it was very good, and then he rested on the seventh day. But the question then becomes, what happened? If it was all very good, what happened? Because we still see evidences of design, but we see things have fallen apart. We see things, see thorns and thistles and death. And those kind of things came in, we find out in Genesis 3. Remember, God gave Adam and Eve just one rule: don't eat from that tree in the middle of the garden, the one that was called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And God gave them that one command. You think about how many laws do we have in our nation today? Thousands and thousands and thousands, probably, right? They had one command, and they didn't even obey that one. And God told them that the result would be death. The wages of sin is death, we read in the New Testament, and that still holds. So we're going to look today at what happened to God's good earth and what happened to these creatures that God created that worked so well in the beginning. And why do we see deterioration? Why do we see death and decay? Why do we see things like mutation and natural selection? So that'll be what we're looking at tonight. Remember, last night we talked about that a lot of people think that evolution is science, but creation is just a religious myth. But in reality, both of these have a religious or philosophical base to them. Both evolution and creation require faith. Now, of course, creation requires faith in a creator God, intelligent, powerful, wise. What's the faith of evolution? Evolution requires faith in what? Time and chance and natural processes. And those are the gods, you might say, or the driving force of evolution. Long ages of time, chance, mistakes, and accidents, and all natural processes. We like to say evolution is a belief system posing as science, and yet people think evolution is science. I remember at one talk that we gave, this man ran up to the book table where I was afterwards. He says, "Your husband just changed my life." I said, "What did he say?" He says, "I never realized evolution is a philosophy. It's a belief system. It's not science." He said, "That makes all the difference in the world." And it really does, doesn't it? Evolution is not a proven scientific fact. It is a philosophy, it is a belief system, but it often ends up posing as science. And it is the basis of a philosophical belief system that is called naturalism. So the question becomes, what belief system do you have? Do we look at things through the idea that there is a creator God, that God started it in the beginning and he continues to be active in his creation, or do we look at it as a purely naturalistic explanation? And a worldview really is based on your belief system. So we might ask, what color is your filter? As you look at the world around you, as you look at the evidences in the world, what color is your filter? Do you put it up and do you see evolution everywhere you look because that's the only thing you've been taught? Or do you look at this world through biblical glasses and see an interpretation that is in conjunction with how God has described it in his word? Your worldview can make a big difference in the way you interpret data. because we all have the same data to work with as evolutionists and creationists. I mean, rocks are just as hard for creationists as they are for evolutionists. And, you know, if you're going out to measure something, you should get the same measurements. The data should be the same if it's accurate data, but the interpretation is what differs. And so we're going to look tonight at some of the ways in which some of the data has been interpreted within an evolutionary framework, and then how we can reinterpret or look at that same data through different eyes, through a biblical framework. That's probably why, you know, you'd have two good scientists looking at the very same data, and one of them goes, wow, isn't evolution wonderful? And another scientist can look at the very same data and go, what an awesome, powerful creator we have. It's because they're looking through different colored glasses, you might say, through a different worldview system. So tonight we're going to look at the idea of creation as it's presented in the Bible, and then we'll also look at the ideas of evolution as normally presented in textbooks and museums and so on around the world. We're just going to, for simplicity's sake tonight, to group these evidences of evolution into these four categories of change and similarity and junk, and then fossils later in the evening. So the first thing is change. Evolution simply means change. So the question becomes, how much change and what kind of change are we talking about? Are we talking about mega evolution that says everything has evolved? That would include cosmic evolution and, you know, even the big, going all the way back to the Big Bang that eventually led to molecules and so on, which eventually got together to form the very first living cells, all the way from molecules to man. We might call that mega evolution or cosmic evolution, or the overall theory of evolution. And then some people believe in evolution that we might call macroevolution, which is new types or new body plans that are being evolved over time. So here we have a fish to the philosopher, and that would be that macroevolutionary kind of idea. Or are we talking simply about change within a created kind, or microevolution or adaptation? So you can get varieties of frogs, but they're still frogs. You can get a variety of dogs, but they're still dogs. And so we might call those the created kinds, those groupings of animals that God created in the beginning. You see certain kinds of evidence, and people will say, isn't that evolution in action? And oftentimes they point to Darwin's famous finches, or they'll look at other kinds of evidence that they say really prove evolution. Well, as we dig in a little deeper, we'll go, is it evidence of evolution in action? Well, not exactly, because it's not the type of evolution that would work to get from goo to you by way of the zoo. What we see in the finches, for example, is variations within that created finch kind. So we're going to look at some of these common evidences of evolution tonight. Let's start with the finches. Oh, we got dogs there. Okay. We have variation. Yes. Big dogs, little dogs. They're still dogs, aren't they? Variation, yes. All right. Go ahead, Dave.
Okay.
We can get all sorts of dogs. We can get wolves. We can domestic dogs. We can breed these dogs one with another. So we might get a coyote mixed with a normal domestic dog, or you can get a coyote wolf mixture, or we can get a wolf with a dog. We can get a domestic Siberian husky will mate with a golden jackal. All of these can intermate together, which helps us to think these were part of the original created kind. And we have seen diversification taking place from that created kind over time from when God. So that's what we mean by the created kind. So we say variation, yes, but that's not evolution, not in the classic sense. Well, let's look at these finches, because Darwin used these as examples to support his idea of evolution by natural selection. He talked about the finches on the Galapagos Island, and he was a careful observer, and he saw these finches had different sizes and shapes of beaks and body types, and they seemed to be adapted for eating different kinds of seeds and so on. And from there, he supposed that they had all evolved from some kind of a common pair of finches that might have come over from South America, and that they had diversified from that time. Well, is it evidence of evolution, though? When we look at it, we go, what did you start out with? Started with finches, right? What do we end up with? We end up with finches, nothing fundamentally new. Now, yes, we see variations within those finches, but those variations, as more sciences come in, as we look at it, that variation seems to be related somewhat to changes within the environmental, dry years and wet years and so on, changes in the environment. And we see these changes are fluctuating. With the introduction of this idea of epigenetics, people are now wondering, are these changes actually due to epigenetics and not evolution at all? Well, let's take a look what we mean by epigenetics. Here's a quote from Dr. Jeffrey Tompkins in the Answers magazine. Dr. Jeff Tompkins is a creationist. He was trained in secular universities in genetics, but he believes in creation. Here's what he says about epigenetics. He says, scientists have discovered that the genes are very similar among the various species. They discovered that epigenetics correlated closely with beak shape and size among the species. Epigenetic mechanisms clearly remain a major player in adaptation. And what does he mean by epigenetics? It's a whole field of genetic studies these days. What it is you have the DNA, the DNA code, the DNA molecules, but upon those DNA molecules, there are other factors, chemical factors that can come in and attach, and it will actually change the way that the genes are expressed. And the interesting thing now is that they found that some of these epigenetic changes are inheritable. And so it's a whole new field of genetic studies in the past, I don't know, 15, 20 years, something like that. But what's the importance of it is I always used to ask the question, we have the DNA molecule, and it's pretty stable except for mutations. But then the question was, well, then how do organisms interact with their environment in order to be able to adapt and to change and to be able to fit into all these various environments that they had to? Because when God told the animals spread out and the people to spread out, he said, fill the earth. Well, that involved going into a lot of different environments, a lot of different ecosystems and habitats. And so we have to have some way for the creature to interact with the environment and to be able to maintain what we call homeostasis or internal conditions at a level playing field, you might say. And epigenetics seems to be one of the ways that happens. So we're not going to go too deep into that topic tonight, but I think it's fascinating. And I think we'll be hearing a lot more about it in the future. What about peppered moths? These are often used as one of the best evidences of evolution. These little critters were around in Great Britain before the Industrial Revolution. At that point in time, the air was nice and clean. There were more light moths than dark moths. They were better camouflaged on the light-colored tree bark. And then they say, oh, you know, those nasty people started burning coal and polluted the air, and the tree bark became dark. And now we find they're more dark moths than light moths. They're more able to be camouflaged from the birds that would come along and eat them. But the problem here is when you really take a look at it, what do you start out with? You start out with moths, light ones and dark ones, and you end up with moths, light ones and dark ones, nothing fundamentally new. Jonathan Wells talked about that in his book, Icons of Evolution, in 2002, and that his research has been confirmed now. These moths, for the original pictures that they got that were so famous in the textbooks, they actually had to take these moths and stick them on the bark of the tree to get the pictures. They don't normally rest on the sides of trees. They are normally nocturnal moths. They fly around at night. In the daytime, they hide up in the foliage or the leaves of the trees. They don't normally rest on the bark and the trunks. And so that whole example might just be a bogus example completely, and yet it has destroyed the faith of so many students. What about antibiotic-resistant bacteria or viruses? We hear a lot about this today, don't we? They tell us in the antibiotic-resistant bacteria, plenty of examples of this. Is this evidence of evolution? And I'd have to say, well, what kind of evolution are we talking about? Are we talking about the molecules to man kind of evolution? Are we talking about just variation within created kinds? What are we talking about? I look at these and I see variation within a created kind. As we look at these bacteria, for example, what do you start out with? You start out with bacteria. What do you end up with? Bacteria. Nothing fundamentally new. They're the same kinds of bacteria. And if you take a petri dish, say, and you put some bacteria on it, and then you throw on there some antibiotic, well, maybe you got a few that will survive that antibiotic. Those few that already had some resistance to that antibiotic then would go on and reproduce until the whole population can become resistant. Is that evolution? I don't believe so, because we aren't getting new genetic information. What we're getting is varying traits which show up in different environments, but that information had to be there to start with in order to produce what we see within these bacteria. And so we see a lot of things that we can say, yes, there's a lot of variation, but evolution? No, not really. It's not mega evolution anyway. What about the races? Was Darwin wrong when he talked about the races? I mean, Darwin talked in his book, Descent of Man, that there were 5 different races of human beings which had evolved from 5 different lines of apes and monkeys. And so some of the races were more advanced than other of those races. Well, first of all, that was a very racist view, wasn't it? And it went along with probably the dominant philosophy of his times, that the whites were more advanced than the dark races and so on. And as we look at it, really, though, what about this whole idea of races? We look at the human population and we see a lot of variation in skin tones. We see some differences in lip shapes and eye shapes and so on. But overall, we see human beings, don't we, with varying colors of skin tone. And actually, you can demonstrate how you can get all of the different skin colors in one generation if you start with parents with medium skin color with the right combination of genes. This little diagram is called a Punnett Square. It's commonly used in genetics to demonstrate what happens with simple genetic crosses. And so we can see up on the upper left-hand corner here, if we start with 2 parents with maximum for skin color here, and again, this is stylized and simplified, but what it'll show you is up in the very upper left-hand corner there, this particular individual, the father had dominant genes for skin color, which are indicated with capital letters. And so the father had A and B both dominant. The mother had both A and B both dominant. And that child would have very, very dark skin. But if you go down to the lower right-hand corner, you see recessive genes. And that person would have very, very light colored skin. And then we have everything in between. We could have 16 different skin colors in 16 different children, statistically, if this was to hold true statistically. And so we can get all the variation in skin color in a very short amount of time. And in fact, creation.com had this in their website, and it shows parents with median skin color and look at their children, twins, who are actually one dark and one light in the very same family. And so it doesn't take many, many millions of years to get the various races. In fact, really, there is only one human race. So if you get in one of these places where they ask you to identify your race, you can always check other and write human race, because there really is only one human race. Now, there are obviously cultural differences and skin color differences, but really human beings are lots more similar than they are different. There's another picture of these twins.
That's another set of twins, actually.
Is it really? Okay.
Uh-huh. They have different names.
Okay.
All right.
This was an interesting article we found back in 2017, how Africans evolved a palette of skin tones. Very interesting article. You want to go on, Dave, to the next one? It says researchers agree that our early Australopithecine ancestors in Africa probably had light skin beneath hairy pelts. How do they know that? Question. Good question to ask is, how do you know that? Okay, next. This was the researcher Tishkov's team found that the story of skin color evolution isn't so black and white. They're finding a lot of differences in the skin colors. The study adds to established research undercutting old notions of race. You can't use skin color to classify humans. And they say in the article, there is so much diversity in Africans. There is no such thing as an African race. And again, that fits with the creation model as human beings. I personally believe that Adam and Eve either were both completely heterozygous, which means they had the most diversity possible, or one was as black as could be and one was as light as could be. And then in the second generation, we'd get all of these variations in skin color. And then after the time of the flood, which tomorrow night Dave will talk about the flood, but after the time of the flood, we see this event called Babel, the Tower of Babel. And from the Tower of Babel, God confused the languages and forced people to spread out around the earth. And I believe at that point in time is when we began to see what we might call racial characteristics being cemented into various cultures and nations and tribes and so on. We'll talk about that on Thursday night. So here's a question for you. According to evolution, how do you get new genetic information? Because this is really the crux of the matter. I mean, if we're going to go from molecules to man, we have to be able to figure out how in the world you get so much new genetic information. And according to Darwin, he didn't really know. He believed in the idea of Lamarckianism, kind of a form of Lamarckianism, where things could be passed from one generation on to the next, these changes, and then they would be saved by this process of natural selection. Now, most scientists today have rejected the idea of Lamarckianism. It just doesn't seem to hold up. And yet, with this idea of epigenetics coming up, I kind of wonder at what point maybe a little bit of what Lamarck said might actually be true. Because here again, Dr. Jeffrey Tompkins says this: everywhere they look, researchers are finding new examples of epigenetic modifications that add or remove special chemical tags in an organism's DNA structure without altering the genetic code. And that's important. It's not changing the genetic code, but it is changing the way that those codes are expressed. He says what's even more incredible is that these alterations can be inherited over multiple generations. And so fascinating. Be on the lookout for this whole idea of epigenetics. I think we're going to find out some really fantastic things as more research is done. Well, what are the proposed mechanisms of Neo-Darwinian evolution? Because Darwin didn't know about mutations. He didn't know how these variations were generated. He just believed they were from his observations. But then he added to that this idea of natural selection, which was the idea that some things survive and some don't survive. Problem with natural, think about this. Neither mutations nor natural selection are creative mechanisms. Neither one can create anything. They can only operate on things that are already in existence. If you're going to mutate something, you have to have something there to start with to be mutated. And if you're going to select for something, you have to have something that can be selected. Well, according to actual observation, we want to find out, though, what do mutations actually produce? And as you study mutations, you find out they can produce in all kinds of aberrant things, like snakes with 2 heads, or cattle with an extra leg on it, or a rooster without any feathers at all on it. And we can see all these aberrations. If you go into the lab at the university, in the genetics lab, you're going to find fruit flies all over the place, because some always escape, it seems like. And you can find flies with different shapes of wings, different colors on their body. Some have curly wings, some have straight wings, some have no wings. This one on the left here has 4 wings. And look what it says about it. The mutant has 4. This rare mutation, like most mutations, is harmful. And then it says beneficial mutations are the raw material for natural selection. Well, what are beneficial mutations? It means that you've got a genetic code, and mistakes and accidents just happen to make that genetic code better than it was before. But we all know that mistakes and accidents lead to downward things, not to better things, but to worse things. And oftentimes they won't even survive. So when we look at the actual observed results with mutations, we find out mutations can result in duplication of information, like we saw in the fruit flies there, 4 wings instead of 2, or loss of information, no wings at all, deregulation of genetic information, like happens in cancer cells, or aging and death. Those are the kinds of things that come about from mutations. Aren't mutations wonderful? I mean, if we really want to be consistent, if we really believe that mutations are the source of new genetic information, then we ought to be advocating for more nuclear testing so that we can increase the mutation rate and let the human race evolve more quickly, right? And yet we all know that doesn't work. Well, Dr. John Sanford is a geneticist. He used to be at Cornell University. He's a well-known geneticist. He was involved in the research that eventually led to deciphering the DNA code. He calls the primary axiom of Darwinian evolution is this idea that evolution proceeds by mutation and natural selection. He goes into his work. The bottom line is this: it does not work. He says that after all his research into genetics. And this guy is a good scientist. He's had over 70 scientific articles, 25 patents in the area of genetics. He was a co-inventor of the gene gun process that helped to decipher the code of GMA. He used to be an evolutionist when he started his research, but over time, he began to see there were many problems with this idea of mutation and natural selection. He ended up writing this book called Genetic Entropy. He became a creationist, and he's a very strong believer now, and he goes around teaching on genetics and creation topics. He said this in the book: mutational entropy appears to be so strong, especially within large genomes, that selection should not be able to reverse it. In other words, natural selection can't get against what he calls mutational entropy, or the downgrading of the genetic code because of mutations. He says it's now clear that mutation and selection cannot stop the loss of genetic information. So mutation and selection clearly could not create the genome in the first place. In other words, our genome is going downhill. Careful analysis on many levels consistently reveals that the primary axiom is absolutely wrong. Now remember, what was the primary axiom? It says that evolution proceeds by mutation plus natural selection. And I love this quote in Sanford's book. He says, if mutation and selection can't prevent the degeneration of the genome, then the primary axiom is wrong. It's not just implausible. It's not just unlikely. It is absolutely dead wrong. It's not just a false axiom. It's an unsupported and discredited hypothesis which can be confidently rejected. So the next time you hear an evolutionist talk about mutation and natural selection, you can just say no. Dr. John Zamford and many, many other geneticists now are recognizing that mutation and selection are not adequate to explain the origin of new kinds of living things. What we do find is that natural selection helps to weed out those mutations, those mutants that are the worst ones, and it helps to maintain some level of fitness within a viable, a level of viability. Well, here's another big question for you then, is where do you get life in the first place? If we have to have life in order to mutate it, and we have to have natural selection, where does it come from in the first place? And I would say here we have a matter of evolutionary speculation versus scientific observation. Everything we know in science, and remember, science is based on observation and experimentation of the real world, this real physical world that we live in. Scientific observation tells us that it takes parents to get children. You have to have the parents there in order to get the next generation. It's one of the best known laws of science. Life comes only from pre-existing life. And yet somehow that textbook, which tells you that life comes only from pre-existing life, someplace else in the textbook tells you that we believe the very first life came from non-living molecules. And you're going, wait a minute, has anybody ever seen that happen? And as a result, no, they haven't. It's all speculation. Here's a quote from Franklin M. Harold. He says this: "We must concede that there are presently no detailed Darwinian accounts of the evolution of any biochemical or cellular system, only a variety of wishful speculations." Now, wishful speculation is not exactly a scientific process, is it? And yet that's where we find ourselves. He says then, we should reject as a matter of principle the substitution of intelligent design for the dialogue of chance and necessity. And so he's saying that despite the fact that all we have is wishful speculation, we can't believe that because why? Because that would be into the realm that he would consider religion instead of science. All right, let's go on. Supposed evidences of evolution, and we've looked at change briefly. We've looked at the idea of mutation and natural selection and talked about the idea that we cannot get the varieties of animals and plants that we see on this globe with the processes of mutation and natural selection. As creationists, we believe we begin that God created those basic kinds, and within those kinds, there's room for variation. Well, here's another category of evidences that are used oftentimes by evolutionists. This is the idea called similar forms or homology. It's the idea that a man's arm, a dog's leg, a bird's wing, a whale's flipper all have a basic similarity. Homology. This is the idea that they're very similar, and because they're similar, people make the claim that that means that they had common ancestry. Well, is that really true? Let's take a look. Let's look at an alternate explanation for similarity, and we believe the alternate explanation is design. Maybe things were designed with a similar function, like variation on a theme. You think about all the varieties of chairs that you could sit on, the easy chair, the recliner, the seat in your automobile, they all have a similar structure because they were designed to do a similar function. So you might say variation on a theme. Or maybe they're similar because they were designed by the same designer. It just shows we have one God, not a pantheon of gods. So for example, if you go into an art museum, you could recognize the paintings done by Rembrandt, for example, because you recognize Rembrandt's style and the kinds of artwork he does. Or maybe things are designed and give this kind of similarity because they were designed to work together. All the organisms have to live in the same ecosystem and the same universe. And so they're all made up basically of the same basic elements that human beings are made of, and paramecium and petunias, they all have the same basic kinds of chemicals. And so you would expect there to be some similarity. This one is one of them that's been used a lot in the past. It was the common idea that said, well, look though, but look at the little human baby. We're very similar to the fish. That must be leftovers from the fish stage. Because look, at 2 months in development, the human baby has gill slits and a yolk sac and a tail. Is that really true? Well, two things you should know about the gill slits is, first of all, they're not gills, and secondly, they're not slits. They're little pouches called pharyngeal pouches. They're in the area of the neck and the jaw region, and they develop into that area of the little baby, but they don't ever develop gills in a human being. That's not their function. In a fish, that area can develop into gills, but they're not gill slits. The yolk sac is not a yolk sac in humans. It doesn't contain any yolk. It's used to form the first blood cells for that little baby, and then later on, when the bones are developed, the blood forming process can take place in the bones. So not a yolk sac. The tail kind of looks like a tail here, but it's not. It just is the end of the spinal column, grows a little more quickly at this stage in development, stimulates the growth of the legs and the other structures in that area, and then later on is body system. So do you see how even in the way that they label these things, gill slits, yolk sac, tail, there's an evolutionary bias being introduced just simply by the naming of these structures. And that already then begins to introduce the idea of evolution to students. And they end up believing that. Ernst Haeckel was one of Darwin's, he was a real fan of Charles Darwin. He developed something called the Biogenetic Law. That had a big long name. It said ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Now, if you want to sound educated, you just memorize that and spout it off at the next party, right? But the idea was this, that the development of the individual inside of the mother's womb or in the egg or something would repeat the stages of evolution. So in other words, for a human baby, it went through a fish stage, an amphibian stage, a reptilian stage, and finally became human. Problem with this, it's been disproven. The embryos, good embryologists can tell the difference in these embryos from very, very early in the developmental stages. And so we can just say no to Ernst Haeckel's idea of the biogenetic law. And in fact, Ernst Haeckel was brought before a board of scientific examiners, and he was chastised for his fraudulent drawings that he was using to try to advance this theory of evolution. So we can just say no to that. We can go on. What about biochemical similarities? This one is the one they're using the most today, and it's based on the similar structure of DNA or RNA or proteins and so on. And comparing those various chemicals, they'll try to come up with a tree of life. And supposedly those that are the closest on that tree of life are the most closely related by evolutionary process. And that's how you get things in the popular magazines, like this Time magazine that said chimps and humans share almost 99% of their DNA. Whoops, 99%. Does that prove we came from apes? Well, as we look at that a little more closely, we find out that that 99% is not really that anymore. That number is going down. it's down to something like 93%. And actually, Jeffrey Thompson says now that it's maybe 86% to 89% is conservative, but he says it looks like it may be as low as 70%. That's pretty low for similarity. And even if that was the case, so what? Does that mean we're related to apes just because we have similar DNA? Not necessarily so. Those of you that have more of a scientific bent and have a good biology background might be interested in checking out Dr. Nathaniel Jensen's book, Replacing Darwin, The New Origin of Species. And he goes in there and shows a lot of problems with some of the older time genetic studies, and he offers a new view of how humans came to be. And then again, you look at it and we saw this in a museum down in Texas. It says the mouse is 97.5% similar to a human being. Or the zebrafish is 92% similar. Or I love this one, the banana is 50% similar to human beings. So did we evolve from bananas or zebrafish or mice or apes and monkeys? Where did we come from? I don't think any of them. I think we just have similarities in our structure because we have the same designer and we're using the same basic chemicals. Way back in 1985, Michael Denton wrote a book. It was called Evolution, A Theory in Crisis. He was not a creationist when he wrote the book. He is a molecular biologist. But way back then, he recognized in the book, he said this, the really significant finding that comes to light from comparing protein amino acid sequences is that it is impossible to arrange them in any sort of evolutionary series. He saw the issue way back then. You can't take these supposed comparisons of protein sequences and arrange them in this evolutionary sequence. Since that time, others have looked at that. Biologist Michael Lynch said clarification of the phylogenetic, that just means evolutionary relationships of the major animal phyla has been an elusive problem, with analyses based on different genes and even different analyses based on the same genes yielding a diversity of phylogenetic trees. Wait a minute, you look at the same genes and you're getting different evolutionary trees out of this? How can that be? It's a real problem for evolution. There was this New Scientist article. The front cover said, Darwin was wrong, cutting down the tree of life. And the title of the article was Uprooting Darwin's Tree. Well, in that article, they showed Darwin's first sketch of a tree of life. And it, very interesting, he wrote this in his journal, but look what he says up there in the corner, I think. It was just his speculation, his idea that he put down in his journal. Since that time, people have continued to try to decipher this tree of life. The article says for a long time, the Holy Grail was to build a tree of life. Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Dave. A few years ago, it looked as though the Grail was within reach, but today the project lies in tatters, pieces by an onslaught of negative evidence. What's the negative evidence they're referring to? It is actually the DNA. The tree of life, one of the iconic concepts of evolution, has turned out to be a figment of our imagination. Now, it's too bad they don't tell the students that in the biology classrooms. They said we have no evidence at all that the tree of life is a reality. And yet it gets presented in classrooms, in textbooks, in museums, on Discovery Channel, everywhere you look. Evolution is presented as if it's a proven fact. Then they end this article, biology is vastly more complex than we thought, and facing up to this complexity will be scary. I don't find it scary. I find it very exciting, actually, because the deeper we look, the more complexity we find, the more it points to a wise and powerful creator. And actually here down at the bottom, we see this, they're sawing down this tree of life by science itself. Scientific evidence is getting rid of the tree of life. And I think we need a lot more of that. Okay, next slide. So supposed evidences, we looked at change, we looked at similarity. Let's take a quick look at what do we mean by junk. Well, junk is supposedly leftovers from evolution, sometimes called vestigial organs, or leftovers that really don't have any function, or that have a vastly decreased function from what they had in the evolutionary past. And at one time, they had a list of 180 things in the human body that they said were useless leftovers. Things like the pituitary gland, the thymus, the tonsils, the appendix, the wisdom teeth. And at the time we were looking at this stuff, and we go, do a little more research, you're going to find that these things have purpose, because God doesn't make junk. If it's there, God originally made it for a purpose. Now, of course, we know the pituitary gland is vital for regulation of processes in the body, many times called the master gland of the body. The thymus, the tonsils, even the appendix, now they're finding, are very important in immunity. And wisdom teeth, they have a very important function too. It's called chewing, just like the rest of your teeth. Now, sometimes people's jaw doesn't develop big enough and those wisdom teeth become impacted and they have to be removed. But just because something can happen to them and make them decay does not mean they didn't have a purpose in the first place. Or just because something can go wrong with it doesn't mean it didn't have a function in the first place. So we look at these leftovers. Well, the one they're looking at a lot today was called junk DNA. Now, when they first came out with this pronouncement, they said 97 or 98% of the DNA molecule. In other words, it doesn't code for proteins. They said it was left over from evolution. All these millions of years left their stamp on our DNA. All this junk was left in our DNA. At the time, we said, go back to the lab, do a little more research. We're going to find out. We predict that this DNA has a function. Well, now we find out it's becoming increasingly clear that most or all of the genome is functional. Can you hear me, Dave, or am I locked up?
You're doing just fine.
Okay, all righty. There was a project back in 2012, was called the Encode Project Consortium. And this was an international research project that tried to take and look at these sections of the DNA that were called junk DNA. And when they started looking at them from all different international people, they came up with a conclusion that said, go ahead and change the slide, Dave. Said almost every nucleotide is associated with a function. In other words, they're not useless junk. They said this metaphor of junk isn't that useful. And it fits exactly what the creationists were saying all along. The key point is it's not junk, it has a function. Here are some of the functions of this so-called junk DNA. Look at this, the uses for, now they call it non-protein coding DNA. It's used aiding in the maintenance of chromosomes. It's used in controlling RNA editing and splicing. It's helping to fight disease and regulating embryological development. And lots more that are being used in this by these non-protein coding DNA sequences. You can get online, you can find a whole list of articles that will give you more information about that kind of thing. So human genome, 20th anniversary, the junk DNA hits the trash. It's not junk at all. And you can read that article in April 12th, 2021 in ICR.org. So no junk, it looks designed. So we look at all these supposed evidences of evolution. We say, well, was Darwin wrong when he talked about biology? And I have to say, he was right about some things, but he was very wrong about other things. He did not understand at all the genetics involved in the various getting the skin colors and so on. In fact, Darwin had no idea about a cell. Darwin thought that the human cell was just a bag of protoplasm. He didn't realize the complexity of all these organelles within the cell. He didn't know anything about DNA and proteins. He had no idea about any of these, the complex biochemistry that's going on within our body systems. And so would Darwin, what if he had known about this complex stuff? Would he still have been an evolutionist? Well, of course, we don't know. We hope so. We hope he would have, but we don't know that for sure, do we?
Would have been a creationist, you mean? Yeah.
Yeah, we wonder if he would have switched from evolution to creation. We don't know.
Yeah.
All right. So we
The
looked at
next-
change, similarity, and junk. But you know, the only real hard facts that we have about evidence for evolution are fossils, right? That's the hard evidence. Well, let's take a look at that.
The fossils are actually considered the very best evidence for evolution by many, many people. The problem is you're going to find out it's not evidence at all for evolution. Even Darwin knew that. He was right about this thing, that geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chains. And this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. He then offered an explanation. The explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geologic record. And when we point out the problems with the fossil record at one of our university lectures that we do, we always hear, well, they just haven't found enough fossils. Okay, keep digging. Imperfection of the geologic record. Well, even Niles Eldredge said 120 years after paleontological research later, it is becoming abundantly clear that the fossil record will not confirm this part of Darwin's predictions. Keep looking, you'll find the missing links, in other words. Nor is the problem a miserably poor record. The fossil record simply shows that this prediction is wrong. And so that's what we know. You know, according to evolutionists, we should find all kinds of missing links, but they're still missing. David Katz wrote some time ago in the magazine called Evolution even. He says evolution requires intermediate forms between species, but the study of fossils does not provide them. And that's true to this day. Arrow White said it back then. But whatever ideas authorities may have on the subject, the lungfishes, that's your great-great-great-granddaddy according to evolution, lungfishes, like every other major group of fishes that I know, have their origins firmly based on nothing. And thought how little I should like to prove organic evolution in a court of law. He knows he'd be torn apart. So the missing links, guess what, are still missing, aren't they? Now we have over 1 billion fossils that have been found and only a few dubious links. So the problem is not the number of fossils. The problem is the number of fossils that don't support evolution. In fact, they don't have enough to show it. So a lot of links? No, that's one of the evolutionary predictions. Okay, what about this idea of the lowest life was simple, then became more and more complex? Let's look at where life started becoming abundant. Clear down in the Cambrian, there's a Denver museum called the Cambrian Explosion. And I've added one word to their display board. 545 million evolutionary years ago, there was an explosion of life, and all the different body shapes and plans popped into existence. That doesn't sound like anything slow and gradual Darwinian at all, does it, when it pops into existence? Things are very complex way down there in the lowest layers. Like trilobites had completely complex eyes. Now they found a bunch of thousands of fossils that had eyes clear down in the Cambrian. And in fact, this one says this eye looks just like the eye from a recently swatted fly. And then they compared it to a robber fly, which has a very powerful vision. So we see extreme complexity way down in the geologic record. What about constant change? You would expect a lot of change in the fossil record, but what do you find? Things that are staying put. In other words, there's a shell, and on the beaches at the top, and the fossil counterpart. There's not enough change for 5 million years, is there? the sassafras leaf and the fossil one, not an iota of difference. Pine cones are still pine cones. Dragonflies, supposedly 140 million years of evolution. No, you should see more change. They found a prehistoric bug in amber, the time supposedly of dinosaurs. The problem is we have the same bug today. He's a type of a mite. Okay, that's indicating stasis. Insects have always been insects. Look at that, no change. You might say that studying fossil insects is like studying insects living today. Denver Museum had this museum display about the sharks, and it's a little hard to read, so here's what it says. The first sharks evolved 450 million evolutionary years ago. You understand, they need the time. We don't if we believe in creation. If God's powerful enough to create, he's powerful enough to get the job done. And then they say this, sharks have changed very little over the years. Well, for 450 million years, you would expect a whole lot more change, wouldn't you? All right, well, now they found a shark that was still swimming, but they say this, that shark is unchanged from his fossil counterpart, supposedly 450 million years of evolutionary time. Okay, they're finding fish now clear down in the Cambrian. They're vertebrate. They had the advanced size, blood vessel, gills, digestive system, muscular swimming. In other words, it's a fish. But keep in mind the complexity even clear down there in the Cambrian, in fact, lower Cambrian here. The coelacanth was thought to have been extinct 65 million years ago. And we find out that the coelacanths 65 million years ago are identical to the ones you find in the fossil record that evolutionists say are 420 million years old, okay? And then they found out the coelacanths are still living. And this thing they call the protoleg, which is the front fin, supposedly on its way to becoming a leg, turned out to be awful fishy, didn't it? So research is indicating what? Not evolution, it's stasis, or things staying put. They don't have the links even showing how that happened. When you find a woodpecker in the fossil record, guess what? It's a woodpecker. You know it. And you don't have to imagine a feather. And many of the fossils that they show of birds supposedly evolving from dinosaurs, guess what? You have to use your imagination. But a feather is easily seen in the fossil record. They've now found over 1,000 fossil bats, but not one of them intermediate. In other words, bats have always been bats. It turns out the same thing with fossil hummingbirds. Hummingbirds have always been hummingbirds, and no in between. They found a fossil lizard in amber back to the dinosaur age. Guess what? There's no change. We can even tell you the species of it because it is still living today. All right. Constant change? No, we don't see that what evolution would basically need to have if it is true. So the evolutionary predictions are all no, but the biblical model would predict certain things based on the creation, the fall, and the flood. Complexity everywhere. Yeah, you better believe it. Things are staying put, not the change you need for evolution. Yep, that's true. And distinct kinds. And that's what it says in the Bible. God created things after their own kind, not one kind changing into another kind. All right. One of the big problems that they've been finding out is they're finding soft tissue in many of the fossils, like salamanders that still had nerves and organs preserved, and even what it just ate for dinner. There's a list of over 40 some in this particular chart. That now list is expanded to well over 100 of fossils they found and analyzed that had soft tissue in it. And in fact, here's one with soft tissue, supposedly more than 500 million years old. That's a 2019 Nature article. Now, wait a minute, think about it. How do you preserve soft tissue for even a few years, let alone 500 million years? Or the age of the dinosaurs with soft tissue, supposedly 140 million years down to 65 million years. And yet they're finding soft tissue, they're finding red blood cells, DNA strands, things that should have decayed in a very short period of time. This is an enigma for evolutionary research. It really poses a problem for those millions and millions of years that you always hear. Now, like I said, I didn't always believe in creation. Here's a picture of me clear back when I was in the 4th or 5th grade teaching on a Grand Junction, Colorado television program how the study of rocks and fossils proved evolution. At that age, I could already teach it because that is all I had ever been taught. So I was thoroughly indoctrinated in evolution. Then that my wife, Mary Jo, found that book, Evolution, the fossils say no. And that made us stand up. And we said, either this guy is crazy, and after reading the book, or he's got a good point. We'd better start doing our own research. And after a while, we've ended up evolving into creationists. Okay. Now, I said the fossil record doesn't support evolution. It actually supports creation. But we hear from students all the time, wait a minute, I've seen lots of pictures in textbooks showing evolution. And one kid was, I think, a 6th grader, and he kind of pouted when we said there's a problem with evolution. He said, well, my book says it's true, and my teacher said it's true too. How do you argue with that, huh? And here he's talking to 2 scientists. Well, yes, we have seen a lot of pictures in textbooks, but you know what? Most people don't realize those are strictly pictures. They are artwork, like this one showing the evolution of the horse. Look at the number of spots, a lot of spots, fewer spots, no spots. Guess what? This is an artistic concept showing how and helping young minds track with change and come up with an evolutionary change over 60 million years is what they'll eventually be taught. But in the younger grades, they're conditioned for it already. Now, there are many things with the sequence that you find in textbooks. First of all, there's a problem with the tooth structure. There's a problem with the foot structure. The number of pair of ribs go back and forth without any pattern whatsoever. And now they have found the bones of present-day horse in rock layers at and below his supposed great-great-great-granddaddies. Now, you can't be your own grandfather, can you? So there's a real problem here. And by the way, the little guy on the left, that's not even a horse. His correct scientific name is not Hippus, which is horse kind. It's Hyracotherium. And we have living Hyracotheriums today, although the artist makes it look like a horse. And here's a Hyrax right there. Now, that's about the size of a rabbit, so you don't want to put a saddle on that beast, do you? Okay, you're not going to get very far. So, yeah, this is considered one of the best proofs for evolution, but I don't see it as proof. Here's a textbook picture showing how a fish crawled out of the ocean and changed into the amphibians, then later became you. Wow. You know, when a second grader that in his book, he should say, great artwork, what's the evidence? And when we speak at many different places, we get the students to shout out, "What question do you ask?" And they all say, "Great artwork, what's the evidence?" And the teachers there kind of shudder in their shoes. But what's the evidence? Okay, what is the evidence for this great change here? The artist makes it look good. Same dumb expression here as you have over here, right? All right. Well, it turns out nothing was found between those two when that book was written. Since that time, they've had 7 or 8 different candidates for fish to amphibian evolution, but every one has fizzled because of the evidence. All right. And yet the textbook says this at the top of the page where this picture is found: missing links show how the process of evolution took place. I like to get the students to ask, wait a minute, how can something missing that has never been found show anything? That's a real problem. All right. Now they have a new candidate for transition from fish to amphibian. They call it Tiktaalik. And basically, it's found up in the very northern parts of North America. And but they say this: it had thick wrist bones. Time out. It's a fin bone. Why do we call it a wrist bone? Unless you're trying to get more mileage out of an evolutionary story. So that is one of the big problems. And the problem is when Bill Nye, the science guy, used that in a debate against Ken Ham a few years ago, Ken Ham could have slammed that, but he didn't. The thing is, before he ever used that in the debate, science has already chucked it. Tiktaalik is out. And in fact, Jennifer Clack from University of Cambridge in the UK said it this way: we thought we'd pin down the origin of limb tetrapods. We have to rethink the whole thing. And the reason is they're digging in a layer below the layers that Tiktaalik are found in a different area. And they have found a trackway of 4-footed creatures coming across there. Wait a minute, these are 4-footed creatures walking across a mud flat that later got preserved. But wait a minute, this thing is moving into 4-footed creatures. Well, 18 million years of evolutionary history before, guess what? They're already exhibiting 4 feet. So that one is out even. So they have no other candidate right now. Well, this is a picture from an actual unit study on evolution used in 4th grade. And they say that minor adaptations over long millions of years will change this creature into the humpback whale. Now, I see a lot of differences, and I'm sure you do too, but that's part of the philosophy here, that this particular dog-like or lion-like creature eventually changed into what? The blue whale. That mostly is speculation, but it's grade 4, unit 4 lesson from Noah. And you say, wait a minute here. What's the evidence for this great artwork? You hope they have the whole skeletons for each of those, but you don't. What's the evidence for the first one? It turns out, here it is, museum display. What was the evidence? Here it is, 2 small shreds of jaw, and that's all they had. Not enough evidence to get that entire creature and determine that it is an ancestor of the whales. All right. Next one in their line was Pachycitis. This is right off of the cover of Science magazine in 1983 in April. And there it shows great artwork for Pachycitis. And students looking at that should not buy what the picture says. That looks kind of like a land animal turning to a whale. They should say, great artwork, what's the evidence? It turns out at that time, all they had for the evidence is found in this other book. You don't find it in the magazine pictured, but all they had was one bone at the back of the skull and a couple of patches of jaw with a few teeth. Nothing else. No backbone, no tail, no legs. So how could something without legs, bones, prove the whale walked? I love pointing this out to children, and I hope you do too. They need to hear this kind of stuff and ask that question, what's the evidence? And hopefully you'll be able to use some of my pictures to get them to ask that. All right, this is the 2004 model. See, this Pachycitis was in the left, found more bones, and they think maybe Pachycitis looked like this. Now, I smell a long-legged rat, and I'm sure you do too, but which is the correct one? The 1983 model or the 2004 model? In other words, will the real Pachycitis please stand up? You see, they don't know. All they have is little fragmentary evidence and somebody's artistic imagination to go along with it. All right, the next one on the line, Ambulocetus. Look at that. Look at the pictures on the right. Oh, wow. Great artwork. What's the evidence? Well, they show it to you in the museum, right? There it is, right there. Well, it turns out they didn't find that whole skeleton. Neither did they find that whole skull. And in fact, when you ask that question, great artwork, you actually look for the evidence, you find out that nice skull that you can actually order casts of to show your students in the science class wasn't exactly what they found. And in fact, we have a video, or there is a video that you can go to, and the gentleman who was actually popularizing it was interviewed, and he had to admit they didn't find the whole skeleton. You see these two colors right here? You see the gray, everything in gray, including most all the teeth, were never found. They're not there. The thing that they would call a blowhole that help distinguish that it's a whale is not in the fossil. It's just not there. And so he finally, he admitted it on an interview on video. And so basically, what do you find? Not the whole skeleton, but pieces like this. Oh, wait a minute. No flippers, really? No fluke turning or tail turning into a whale thing. Not there at all. Oh, by the way, when you ask that question, what's the evidence? They might give you this one. They have found bones in this position on a whale, which were leftover or vestigial legs. Now, when I look at it, I don't see much of a leg or even a leftover, but it's just tiny, a little fragments. Some of them are a little longer, but the thing is, what are they? Well, September 2014, there was an article came out in the University of Southern California in their news release and the research that we're doing there. And they came out with something that, keep in mind, they're not a creationist group. There's a vital function found for these bones. It's very important in the reproduction of the whales too. And so here's the article. Researchers turn a long accepted evolutionary assumption that these are vestigial legs on its head. And so that's the latest on that one. You'll read National Geographic. You know what they'll tell you? Dinosaurs evolved into birds. Wow. Then they show you these beautiful pictures and they show you, wow, here's a bird turning into a dinosaur. And if you use your imagination, this little stuff are feathers. Now, I showed you a picture of a feather of a woodpecker before, and what is that showing you? You can identify a feather. These are not feathers, but it turns out this supposed missing link that they really popularized was a hoax. Okay, it was a hoax. There's the article, scientists dispute missing fossil, missing link fossil. Turns out this was actually put together from not 2 different fossils, but up to 5 different fossils by some Chinese resident and then sold to a museum, probably for a lot of money. And, but deception that was going on there. We're going to talk more about that in the Thursday night when I talk about dinosaurs. So the question is, did dinosaurs evolve into birds? I'm going to let you wait to Thursday to get the answer to that. Okay. National Geographic talks about human evolution, but we have to understand something. When they talk about human evolution, there's a lot of artwork involved in it. And they're trying to embrace and teach you evolution. So what's the evidence for some of this thing? Here's the textbook right here. Wow, great artwork. What's the evidence? Okay, well, let's look at one of these guys here. Let's go look at this one right here. What's the evidence for him? Well, you'd hope they have the whole skeleton, but they didn't. All they had was the skull cap and nothing else, no other bones. And from that skull cap, they got the entire artwork. Now, it's my contention, it is not the evidence that convinces people of evolution, it's the artwork, and only the artwork. Here's a 2nd grade book used in the Grand Junction area. Shreds of a jaw, and from that they got Mr. Rhompithecus, and then on the next page the rest of the family. Kind of stretching it, isn't it? And no, you can't tell what he looked like from little scant evidence like that. Okay, this was in the newspapers, 1922. What's the evidence? Well, turns out 1 tooth, a whole tooth, but nothing but the tooth. And then later turned out to be a pig's tooth. And but that's what they thought he looked like. And again, ask that question. What's the evidence? How about Piltdown Man? What's the evidence for him? Well, it turns out it was a hoax. Somebody took the jaw of an ape, filed on the teeth, put it together with the skull of a modern man, colored everything, and then hid it for a scientist to find. And sure enough, they took the bait. All right. And they ended up coming up with that picture of Piltdown Man. The problem is it stood as proof for human evolution for 80 years, at least, even 50 years after it was proven to be a hoax. So that's so sad. It's hard to get something out of a textbook once it is in there. What about Lucy? Oh, this is a very popular one. It turns out they now think Lucy wasn't a he, it was a she, which puts it in a completely different species. But Johansen found about 40% of a skeleton, he said. And but look at that. There's no head. There's no feet, no hands. But look what the artist does over here. Give him a beautiful set of hands and a beautiful face for Lucy. Again, that's all artwork. It's this type of artwork that convinces people of evolution, not the actual evidence whatsoever. All right, this particular article says Tim White made this reconstruction of Lucy and friends using parts of, get this, not one, not two, but several individuals. He says the section at the back of the skull is the crushed cranium mentioned in the text. It contains 107 separate pieces. Now, wait a minute, they're putting things together from 2 different locations, maybe? That's what they did with Lucy. The thing that they're trying to gain a lot of mileage out of it is the knee of Lucy. And it turns out it was found 2 to 3 kilometers away from the rest of the pieces of the skeleton. Again, artwork, and maybe a little deception or at least bias is entering into here. Okay. Okay, here's another one. They show a toe bone of a skull. And they said the toe bone proves the creature walked on two legs. The problem is it wasn't found with the scraps. It's found 10 miles away from the skull fragments, assumed to be the same species. And that's a real problem. Well, if you want the latest and the greatest evidences presented and what's wrong with it on the human evolution spectrum, get the book Contested Bones. You can get it at our office. We have it here. Just call there and you can order it. It talks about Neanderthal, Lucy, Ida, Artie, Naledi. This is some of the latest finds, actually. You can also get the book, The Fossil Record, from our office, and it is probably the best book on the fossil record that I think is available today. And it's amazing, beautiful pictures throughout the whole thing. I love that book. All right. So what do the fossils indicate? You find complexity everywhere. Yep. You find out things are staying put. You see distinct groups. And in some fossils, you see evidence of very rapid burial. All of this points to the creation, all the complexity, and then later the flood with quick burial. We're going to talk more about that tomorrow night, okay? All fits the biblical record of creation, the fall, and the flood. And so tomorrow night's session is Noah's flood, fact or fiction, as part of our Science Cries Out Creation series. A Thursday night session is Beyond the Flood. What about Babel? How does the Ice Age fit into it? What about mammoths? How about dinosaurs? Wait a minute, hold on. I put dinosaurs in post-flood? You'll have to join on Thursday to find out why I do that. And that doesn't mean dinosaurs weren't there before the flood, or many of them got killed in the flood. And remember, visit our website, discovercreation.org, okay? There you can find out evidence or you can find out information on our Costa Rica creation tour. And if you want to go with us, spring 2023, let me remind you, you need to tell me soon so we can nail down a date that works. Okay, Yellowstone creation tour. We have 2 different ones coming up at the end of August and over Labor Day weekend. And so what a fabulous tour for the whole family on the Yellowstone National Park. So basically, the evidence cries out creation. All right. And get all this information at our website, discovercreation.org.